The morning began like most others in the Ozark Hills. Cool air, wet grass, and the quiet rustle of leaves trying to decide if summer was truly over. George Whitman stood on his back porch, one hand around his chipped enamel mug, the other resting on Scout's head. The dog leaned in like he always did, a silent ritual between two old souls who didn't need to say much anymore. Then came the sound. It sliced through the treetops like a jagged blade. Not a coyote's yip or a mourning dove's call. Not even the desperate bark of a lost farm dog. No, this was different. Wild, high-pitched, raw, and utterly human. For a full second, George couldn't move. Scout lifted his head, ears up. Then came another cry, sharper cracked at the end. The mug fell from George's hand and shattered on the steps. Within minutes, George and Scout were headed into the woods behind the barn, following the direction of the sound. There was no hesitation. Not for George, not for Scout. The forest had grown thick these past few years, branches arched like arms, overgrown with thyme vines, reclaiming what fences once defined. It had been a long time since anyone had gone this deep. But Scout found the trail. He always did. About 200 yards in, just beyond the old sugar maple grove, they found her. Cedar. A bobcat, barely more than a kitten in size, but wild enough to turn away most eyes. Not George's, not now. She stood on her back legs beside a collapsed stone well, front paws clawing the air like she was begging. Her fur was a patchwork of mossy brown and river rock gray, her chest rising and falling like she'd run for miles. She didn't snarl, she didn't back away. She just kept making that sound, half growl, half scream, but unmistakably pleading. George had seen her before. Not recently. Months ago, when Jenna brought her home, thin and trembling after a forest fire displaced a den of wild cat babies. The Wildlife Rescue Center had been full. Jenna, his granddaughter with too much heart and too little fear, had nursed Cedar back to life right here at the farm. And when the time came, they released her a few miles north back into the wild. Jenna cried that day. George remembered because it was one of the only times she let herself. Now Cedar was back, and she wanted something. Scout barked one short yelp like a signal. George stepped forward closer to the well. The rocks were cold beneath his palm as he leaned over the edge, flashlight in hand. At first he saw only dark, but then a flicker, a boot, mud-caked, then a pale hand. Jenna. His voice came out dry like bark stripped from a tree. He dropped to his knees, flashlight beam now steady. There she was, curled against the wall of the well ropes around her arms, water rising slowly past her waist. Her head tilted forward, unmoving. Scout barked again. Cedar paced, tail twitching, climbing onto the stones like she was going to leap. George's hands scrambled to his belt, pulling out his phone. No service. Of course. There never was this far out. He looked back at the well. No ladder, no pulley, no one around for miles. Just a wild bobcat, an aging dog, and a man too old to be the hero he wanted to be. The kind of scene that doesn't make sense on paper, but life never really did out here. It just happened quiet, strange, and deeply personal. This wasn't just some cute animal video you scroll past in the evening. This was real. Jenna's real. And Cedar somehow knew something was wrong. What makes a wild animal come back to the place of its rescue only to cry for help? It wasn't instinct. It wasn't training. It was something else. Something that bridges the unspoken space between species. Some call it animal love. Others call it survival. But maybe, just maybe, it's the same thing. In that moment, George understood the silent truth beneath Cedar's cries. Someone had to act, and no one else was coming. He ran, fast as his knees allowed. Back to the barn, Scout keeping pace. He hadn't run like that in years, not since Martha died. Not since Jenna left for college. But that morning the past didn't matter. Age didn't matter. Heart pills on the kitchen table didn't matter. Only Jenna mattered. That cry in the woods had woken something in George that grief had buried long ago. Urgency. Purpose. Fear, yes. but not the paralyzing kind, the kind that moves your feet before your brain catches up. It would have been easy to dismiss Cedar's cries. A wild cat making noise happens all the time. But George had lived long enough to know when something pulls you from routine, there's usually a reason. Especially in places like this. Quiet places. Wild places. Sacred places. He grabbed the old rope from under the grain sacks, Martha's rope, hand-woven stubborn stained by decades of use. Ugly as sin, but it never broke. And George wasn't about to start doubting it now. As he jogged back toward the well rope, coiled in one hand, flashlight in the other, he thought about how strange life had become. A wild bobcat acting as lookout, a dog ready to leap, a granddaughter at the bottom of a stone hole, and an old man racing time with nothing but a rope and a gut feeling. You can't write scripts like this. You can't plan for it. You just follow the cry. That's the lesson George would carry long after. The world may feel disconnected. People may seem more distant than ever, but sometimes a bond forms in silence, in eye contact, in actions, not words. And sometimes it's not people who teach us that it's the animals, the wild ones, the ones we think are too far gone to love us back. As George reached the clearing again, Cedar was still there, pacing. She hadn't moved. Scout let out a low whine, pushing his nose toward the well. The sun was higher now, filtering through the trees, casting soft gold across the stone. The forest held its breath. George tied one end of the rope to a nearby oak, knotted it with the strength of someone who'd done this 1,000 times, and began to lower it into the dark. "Hold on, Jenna," he whispered. "Just hold on, baby girl. Grandpa's here." Cedar stood still, finally quiet. And in that silence, George realized something else. This wasn't just a rescue. This was a reckoning. Something or someone had put Jenna down there. A wild animal hadn't done it. Nature hadn't turned cruel. This was human, deliberate. And whatever Jenna had been working on before she disappeared, the land deals, the environmental research, the private investment firm that kept sending mail, suddenly took on a darker shade. This wasn't just about saving a life. It was about uncovering a truth. And Cedar, in a wild, desperate cry, had been the first one brave enough to speak it. Scout barked once. Cedar blinked slowly. George tightened the rope. And so began a story not just of survival, but of justice. George Whitman was not the kind of man people wrote about. He never climbed a mountain or built an empire. He didn't have medals tucked in a drawer or photographs from exotic travels. What he had was this land, 127 acres of dense Arkansas woodland, 3 pastures and an old house his father built with bare hands and borrowed lumber. And for most of his life, that had been enough. He'd spent 42 years waking up before the sun, fixing fences in the cold, checking on cattle through ice storms and harvesting hay until his back screamed. He wasn't the kind to complain. Farmers rarely are. There's a certain kind of pride that settles in the bones when you build something with years instead of bricks. But pride doesn't cushion grief. Martha had died quietly. No ambulances, no drama. Just a stroke one Wednesday morning while she was folding towels and humming a hymn. She didn't even get through the first verse. George found her lying beside the laundry basket like she'd just sat down for a rest. He called her name 3 times before realizing silence had answered him back. After that, something left with her. The kitchen stopped smelling like biscuits. The porch light stayed off. And for the first time in his long, stubborn life, George began to forget why he got up in the morning. He stopped planting corn, sold off the last of the cattle to a company out of Texas. Let the barn go quiet. Scout, his Australian shepherd, stuck by him through it all. The dog never whined, never barked for attention, just stayed close enough to remind George he wasn't completely alone. On the worst nights, when the weight on George's chest felt like a truck parked on his ribs, Scout would rest his head across George's boots and breathe slow and steady until George remembered how to do the same. Then came Jenna. His granddaughter arrived with a duffel bag, a camera, and the kind of urgency young people carry when they're trying to fix the world. She worked for a non-profit focused on wildlife rescue, specifically wildcat babies. Bobcats, cougars, lynx. She called them her wildlings. George called them trouble with fur. But when he watched her cradle an injured bobcat cub and speak to it like a child, he knew something deeper was happening. Jenna wasn't just saving animals. She was saving herself, and in doing that, she saved him. It started small. She cleaned out the barn, cooked once a week, showed him how to use the microwave properly without burning his coffee. They didn't talk about Martha much, or about why she really left the city. Some wounds are too fresh to name, but one Saturday they found an injured bobcat kit in a drainage ditch near the river. Jenna named her Cedar. George had never seen a creature so fierce and fragile. At the same time, Cedar had one broken paw, a missing patch of fur, and enough attitude to bite through 2 layers of Jenna's gloves. She was wild in every sense, and yet she let Jenna hold her, let her whisper to her, let her tend the wounds that would have festered in silence. That animal should have disappeared back into the trees after recovery, but she didn't. She lingered near the edge of the woods for weeks after her release, as if something unfinished held her here. George understood that feeling too well. They say wild animals don't love you back, that the bond is one-sided. But George wasn't so sure. After all, wasn't love just the act of showing up again and again, even when you could leave? He thought of that now, kneeling at the edge of the well. Jenna's pale hand barely visible in the shadowed water. Cedar beside him. Scout silent. No one else was coming. No cavalry, no rescue team. He felt the years in his knees, the ache in his chest. He knew he shouldn't be doing this, not with the meds forgotten on the kitchen table and his heart acting like a stubborn mule. But none of that mattered, because when you've lost everything, you stop fearing loss. And when you love someone, even the whisper of their name in danger is enough to burn away hesitation. He looped the rope around the oak. It was Martha's rope, the one she made the year they had no money for proper fencing. She'd taken strips from her old dresses, some denim, even part of a red gingham shirt George wore on their first date. Braided it together with wire and grit. It had been used to pull calves, hang quilts, tie down feed bags in windstorms. Ugly as sin. But it never once gave way. George looked at it now like it was an old friend. Worn, dependable, still holding on, just like him. His life had become small in recent years. Grocery trips, doctor visits, walking scout to the same 3 spots in the woods. And yet beneath that quiet was a man who had once fought droughts, buried friends, pulled calves in snowstorms, and kissed a woman for 50 years straight. That kind of love carves deep roots. That kind of history doesn't die quietly. It waits. For moments like this, where everything you've learned, the pain, the patience, the perseverance comes roaring back, not for your own sake, but for someone else's. George wasn't strong anymore, but he was steady. That rope in his hand was more than twine and cloth. It was a lifetime of holding, enduring, and believing things could still be fixed. As he eased it into the well, his breath shallow, he whispered to Jenna. Told her about Scout barking at deer last week. Told her how he'd been saving the last jar of peach preserves she made. Told her that Cedar had come home. And then he said something he hadn't said out loud in 2 years. I'm not done yet. Maybe that's what this was all about. Maybe that cry in the forest, that wild animal circling a well like her own soul, was trapped beneath it. Maybe that was life saying you still matter. Too often we assume older folks have nothing left to give, that their stories are behind them. But here was George Whitman, 72, heart ticking like an old clock, risking everything to pull his granddaughter from death's doorstep. And he was doing it with a rope his wife made out of scrap. There's a lesson there, about usefulness, about grace, about the quiet strength that holds the world together in moments no one will ever see. Not every hero wears a badge or lifts a car off a child. Sometimes a hero is just an old man with weathered hands, a broken heart, and a rope he never thought he'd need again. Somewhere below, Jenna stirred. George heard her voice, barely more than a breath. "Grandpa?" He looked at Cedar, then Scout, then back into the dark. "Hang on, baby. We're going to get you out." And somewhere deep in his chest, he felt something shift, not just pain, but purpose. Like the land itself was rooting for him. Like every sunrise he'd ever watched was waiting for this day. George didn't know what Jenna had gotten herself into, but he knew she'd come back to this land for a reason. Just like Cedar. Just like him. And before this was over, he would learn exactly what that reason was. Cedar shouldn't have come back. That's what all the wildlife guides would say. Once a bobcat is released into the wild, she doesn't return, not to people, not to places, not to memories. Her instinct should have pushed her deeper into the forest, away from human scent, from voices, from rope and danger and trust. But Cedar wasn't behaving like a wild animal that morning. She was behaving like something else entirely. She had been pacing near the edge of the well for over 20 minutes by the time George returned with the rope. Her paws were bloodied from scraping against stone. Her body moved with restless urgency, circling, pausing, yowling again. It wasn't the low, territorial growl of a bobcat defending space. It wasn't the warning snarl of a predator. It was high-pitched, sharp, desperate. George didn't understand what she was doing, not at first. She kept looking at him, holding his gaze, then staring back into the well. And again, as if she needed him to see what she saw. As if she were saying, "He is still down there." "Hurry." Every time Scout whimpered or barked, Cedar would answer with a whine of her own, her ears twitching at the edge of every new sound. George tied off the rope. His hands moved on muscle memory. The knot held, and all the while Cedar watched, close, unblinking. Later, George would remember that moment not just because of what it led to, but because of what it said about Cedar, about wild animals in general, and about the thin, easily ignored truth that sometimes animals know what we miss, that their instincts go deeper than survival. Sometimes they tap into something ancient, almost spiritual. You can call it animal companionship or imprinting or whatever scientific term makes it easier to file it away. But George knew better now. This was loyalty. Cedar had only lived with Jenna for 5 weeks. Just long enough to mend her broken leg, regain strength, learn how to hunt without falling over. Jenna had fed her, yes, but she'd done more than that. She'd sung to her while applying ointment, spoken to her in soft tones, even when she hissed, sat on the floor with her, giving her space until she was ready to take it. Jenna had never forced affection. She had waited for Cedar to choose it. And that made all the difference. It wasn't domestication. It wasn't training. It was something gentler, something free. George recalled a moment quiet and small when he'd seen Jenna lying on the living room rug reading a book while Cedar, freshly bandaged, slept beside her. They weren't touching. They weren't playing. They were just existing together, trusting each other, sharing the quiet. So maybe it wasn't so strange that Cedar had come back. Maybe she remembered the trail that led to safety. Maybe she remembered Jenna's scent soil, lavender shampoo, and something else presents. Or maybe when Jenna didn't return to the forest, as she usually did on her weekly check-ins, Cedar knew something was wrong. Something. Maybe the woods themselves whispered that something sacred had been disturbed. And maybe that's why she ran. Somewhere in the stretch between instinct and intuition, Cedar chose not to stay hidden. She chose to cry out. For a bobcat, that's no small act. In the wild, sound draws attention. Sound brings predators. Vulnerability is danger. Silence is safety. So, why cry? Why risk it? George thought about that as he leaned over the edge of the well, voice hoarse from calling Jenna's name, trying to reach her through 30 feet of stone and dark. He thought about how it had been Cedar, not him, not Scout, not even luck that led him here in time. Without her, Jenna would have drowned in that silence. A wild cat baby had brought him back to the world. There was something sacred in that. Something holy, even. He didn't say it out loud. That wasn't his way. But he knew, in his bones. Cedar was more than just another rescue story. She was a messenger. The story that often gets told in videos. Cute animal finds. Human cute animal helps human cute tears and likes is just the surface. What sits beneath is something heavier, something worth more than virality. It's this. When animals act out of character, it's often because we've underestimated their capacity for care, for loyalty, for response. They may not love us the way we define love, but they recognize safety. They remember kindness. And when those things are threatened, they don't always run away. Sometimes, like Cedar, they run toward the danger. It's easy to see humans as the rescuers, the fixers. But what if we've had it backward all along? What if animals rescue us just as often? And not just in moments like these, life or death, but in quiet ways too. A dog laying its head on your lap after a hard day. Cat curling up beside your mother's bed as she fades. A baby bobcat returning to a well with a cry sharp enough to snap a man from grief. It happens, more often than we admit. George stood now, rope lowered, Jenna barely clinging to consciousness. He called to her again. She responded with a weak, garbled sound. He couldn't make out the word, but Scout barked in reply. Cedar pressed her front paws against the stone as if she wanted to dive in. George reached down and gently touched her fur. She flinched, then stilled. Her side rose and fell quickly. Adrenaline, anxiety, recognition. "It's okay, girl," he whispered. "You did good." It wasn't until later, when the sheriff asked how he found her, when the EMTs shook their heads at how close the timing had been, when the nurse at the hospital said, "You were lucky that George thought to correct them. This wasn't luck, he told them. This was Cedar." And to anyone who didn't understand what that meant, he had nothing more to say. Because some truths don't need to be argued, they just need to be witnessed. So what do we take from a story like this? A small lesson, maybe? One worth remembering. That connection doesn't follow rules. It doesn't care about species or logic or what science says should or shouldn't happen. It forms where there's safety, where there's gentleness, where there's trust. And when it's real, it endures even through forest and time and fear, even across language and silence, even when it comes back in the form of a wild cry at an old well. George looked at Cedar one last time before focusing fully on the rescue. She sat now finally still, eyes fixed on the rope. She didn't yowl again. She didn't need to. Her part was done. She'd cried for help, and the right person had heard her. The rope made a soft sound as it slid down the well, the braided fabric scraping against ancient stone. George lowered it carefully, his hands trembling, not from fear exactly, but from the weight of knowing there might not be a second chance. Jenna's life now depended on a rope made by a woman who'd been gone 2 years, and a man whose heart had been giving warning signs for the past 10. He kept one hand steady on the line, letting it unwind foot by foot. Beside him, Scout stood rigid, watching the well. Cedar, too silent now, tail flicking slowly. The forest had gone still. Even the birds seemed to understand. George called again. "Jenna, can you reach it?" No answer. Then the faintest ripple of sound, like breath pulled through wet cloth. It wasn't a word, not quite, but it was something. He clutched the rope tighter. "It's me, honey. It's Grandpa. You hang on now. You just hang on." He didn't know if she heard. He couldn't see her clearly anymore. The light was fading fast, and the water was rising faster. Another few inches, and she'd be completely submerged. From what he could tell, her hands were bound. She couldn't climb. She couldn't even hold on. The math ran through his mind, depth, angle, weight. There was no way she was pulling herself out of that well. Not alone. He had 2 options. Lower himself down with the rope and try to tie her in somehow, or find someone to help. But town was 20 minutes away. Cell service didn't exist out here, and every second Jenna stayed in that water stole warmth from her body. Hypothermia wasn't some far-off idea. It was real, and it was coming. George glanced toward the oak where he'd anchored the rope. It would hold. Martha's rope always did. But would he? He reached into his back pocket. Nitroglycerin pills. Shook one into his hand, dry swallowed. The pressure in his chest hadn't eased, but it wasn't worse yet either. Scout let out a low, worried sound. George turned to him. "Not yet, boy. We don't give up." It wasn't a dramatic moment, no music, no slow motion, just an old man making a quiet decision that could cost him everything. He pulled the rope back up. It was time to try again. A different way. This time he tied a slip knot near the bottom, something wide enough that if he could guide it under Jenna's arms, he might be able to hoist her out. Maybe. If she stayed conscious long enough, if her arms could even move. The plan was fragile, like glass underfoot. He called down again. "Jenna, baby girl, I need you to help me if you can. I'm sending down the rope again. I'm going to try to get it under your arms." "Okay." No reply. The water was high now. He couldn't see her face anymore, just the movement of her jacket, the smallest shift that let him know she was still breathing. Time was unraveling, and there was no one to blame but whoever put her there. That truth, sharp and cruel, pressed hard against his ribs. This hadn't been an accident. Jenna hadn't fallen. Someone had tied her, left her. And if Cedar hadn't come, he shook the thought loose. No time for that now. The rope disappeared into the darkness again. George leaned into it, easing it down, feeling every inch. He remembered something years ago, maybe 30, maybe 40. A calf had fallen into a mud pit during a spring storm. He'd pulled it out, using this same rope one knot at a time, Martha holding the lantern. The calf hadn't made it, but he remembered how Martha had looked at him afterward, not with sadness, but admiration. "You didn't stop," she'd said. "That matters." So he wouldn't stop now. He tested the tension. It felt like the rope had caught on something, then movement. Scout barked once. George braced his feet and started pulling. The weight was heavy, slower than he expected. He wasn't sure if it was just Jenna or if something was resisting water drag fatigue or worse. Inch by inch, he hauled the line. His breath came shallow. His shoulders screamed. His knees buckled once, but he didn't let go. And then she came into view. Her head above the water, chin barely resting on the rope loop. Eyes closed, lips blue. The rope was under her arms, just like he'd hoped, but not tight. It had shifted. If he pulled wrong, she could slip. He kept going. Cedar moved closer, almost stepping onto the stones. George didn't stop her. Let her watch. Let her witness what connection looks like in real time. Because this wasn't just a rescue. It was a reckoning. This rope, this old piece of patchwork and purpose, was doing what it was made for. It was carrying love up from the dark. A few more feet. George's back arched. The pain in his chest flared again, sharp and bright. His grip faltered. Scout barked louder this time. George gritted his teeth. "Not now," he muttered. "Not now." He pulled again. Jenna's foot cleared the rim, then her knee, and then finally her full weight came over the edge. She collapsed onto the grass like a fallen branch. George dropped to his knees beside her, pulled off his jacket, wrapped it around her. Her eyes fluttered. "Grandpa." He didn't answer right away, just leaned his forehead against hers and let the relief break him open. His breath came hard. Not quite a sob, but close. "You're okay," he whispered. "You're here." Scout licked her cheek. Cedar stood behind them, still watching. Later, when the medics would come and take Jenna away, when the sheriff would ask questions, when a full investigation would unfold, people would talk about the rope, about the effort, about George's stubborn refusal to let go. But George would remember something different. He would remember Cedar standing still, Scout not barking, the air silent. And he'd remember this small truth that survival is not always loud. Sometimes it's quiet. Quiet as a rope tightening slowly in wet stone. Quiet as an old man refusing to stop pulling. There's a lesson in that. Sometimes the tools that save us aren't shiny or new. Sometimes they're the things we nearly throw away because they look too worn, too ugly, too outdated. But those are the things with memory, with weight, with stories. That rope had been a clothesline, a tie-down, a calf lifter, a symbol of Martha's love. Now it was a lifeline. The sun filtered through the trees again, warm on Jenna's face. George smiled faintly, for the first time in a long while. But deep down he knew this wasn't over. Someone had put her in that well, and he intended to find out who. The sheriff's office smelled like coffee and printer ink, the kind of small-town quiet where every word leaves a mark. George sat stiffly in a metal chair, a blanket still over his shoulders. His shirt was damp from Jenna's rescue, his heart meds tucked into his coat pocket like a forgotten apology. Across from him sat Sheriff Monroe, a man George had known for 40 years who once fixed tractors for a living and now carried a badge heavier than it looked. His face said what his mouth hadn't yet. This wasn't just an accident, and no one here wanted to say the word attempted murder until they had to. Jenna lay 3 doors down, bundled in warm blankets, hooked to an IV. A nurse said she'd been drugged before she was dropped in the well. Not enough to kill her, but enough to weaken her body. Whoever tied her hands had meant for her to drown quietly, no signs, no clues, just gone. But Cedar had cried, and George had listened. Now they had questions. Big ones. The first came from George, steady and low. Who would do this to her? Sheriff Monroe didn't answer right away. He opened a file on his desk, pulled out a few papers, then turned one toward George. A bank statement, highlighted, circled, Jenna's handwriting. It was one of dozens she'd been reviewing in the weeks before her disappearance. She'd been looking into land transfers, Monroe said, specifically in the Ozark Corridor, wildlife corridors, conservation zones. George nodded slowly. She said something about that last month. Said people were buying forest land under shell companies, not just people. Monroe said. One person. Elliot Harris. The name hit George like cold water. He knew Elliot. Everyone did. Ran a land investment firm out of Little Rock. Suave, polished. One of those men who smiled with his mouth, but never his eyes. Showed up to fundraisers for animal rescue centers and posed for photos with rescued baby bobcats like he understood the meaning of compassion. Gave generously, spoke kindly, and bought land like a man playing chess 5 moves ahead. Jenna hadn't trusted him. She told me he was hiding something, George said. Said he was using donation money to buy land cheap from older farmers off the books. Worse, Monroe replied. She found paperwork suggesting he was rerouting grant funds, setting up dummy non-profits to acquire conservation land, then quietly selling mineral rights to developers. Fracking, George asked. Possibly, Monroe said. Or worse. Jenna had collected emails, bank transfers, even internal documents from one of his foundations. She was planning to turn it all over to a federal wildlife task force next week. George leaned back, the weight of it all pressing down hard. So he silenced her. That's the theory. The silence that followed felt heavy with something else, guilt. Because in small towns, crimes like this didn't happen often. And when they did, they felt personal. Elliot wasn't an outsider. He'd grown up 3 towns over. He'd married local, donated to the firehouse, sent holiday cards to City Hall. He was one of theirs. And now he was the man who tied George's granddaughter and left her to die. It didn't add up, not on the surface. But beneath it, things shifted. Because this wasn't just about one man and one girl. It was about a pattern. One George had seen his whole life. The way systems wear masks. The way bad things dress themselves up in good intentions. Elliot didn't look like a villain. He looked like a success story. And maybe that's why no one noticed what Jenna had. She told me the animals were just the beginning, George said quietly. She said if we lost the land, we'd lose everything. Bobcats, cougars, bears, the birds that followed the creeks. Monroe nodded. She was right. There's a lesson there one too many overlook. The ones who fight to protect the wild often fight alone, because their enemies don't always carry guns or bulldozers. Sometimes they carry briefcases and wear suits. They smile, they donate, and then they dig. Jenna had seen through the smile. George thought back to the day she brought Cedar home. The kit had been limp-soaked from rain, barely breathing. Most people would have walked past, left her, said she wouldn't make it. But Jenna had wrapped her in an old flannel and whispered, "You deserve to try." That was Jenna's heart, always offering rescue even when it wasn't safe. She'd done the same for the forests, the streams, even for Elliot Harris once. That part hadn't made sense to George at first, but the more Monroe explained, the more the pieces shifted into place. Jenna hadn't gone to the press. She hadn't filed a formal complaint immediately. She'd scheduled a meeting with Elliot, alone. She wanted to give him a chance, Monroe said, to come clean. George stared at the sheriff. She thought he'd fix it. She hoped he'd remember the part of himself that used to care. And maybe he had. Maybe in some twisted moment of fear or shame, he'd panicked instead, tied her hands, dropped her down a well, walked away and tried to forget. But you don't forget things like that, especially not when a wild animal comes back screaming. Later that afternoon, the sheriff's deputy found tire tracks near the well, fresh. They matched Elliot's truck. Inside his office, a folder sat open on his desk. Jenna's name written in red marker across the top. Copies of her findings. A printed map of conservation zones she had been investigating. A calendar reminder. Meeting with JW. Noon Monday. That was the day she disappeared. The case was building fast, and yet it still didn't explain everything. Why, George asked. Why go so far? Monroe hesitated, then handed George one last file. Inside a death certificate. Name Amy Harris, age 12. His daughter, George asked. Leukemia, Monroe replied. Died 6 years ago. Denied insurance coverage for an experimental treatment. Harris never recovered. That's when he started his foundations, his land trusts. But it got messy. Funding got tight. The rage turned into something else. George stared down at the page. So it wasn't just greed. It was grief. Twisted, buried, but not gone. Elliot hadn't just wanted to make money. He wanted to fix something. But the fixing had turned into taking, and the taking had turned into silencing. That's the danger with grief left unspoken. It mutates. It burrows. It convinces you that desperate things are noble, that breaking the rules is justified if the cause is worthy. But no cause is ever worth a rope and a well. George stood slower, now older than he'd felt that morning. The room felt colder, the future heavier. Is she safe now? He asked. For now, Monroe said, but Elliot hasn't turned himself in. He will, George said. He's not the kind to run. How can you be sure? George looked out the window, past the courthouse lawn, past the street where Jenna once held signs to protect an eagle's nest from logging crews, past the town she still believed in, because he knows what's coming next. 3 days after Jenna was rescued, Elliot Harris walked into the sheriff's office and turned himself in. No cameras, no lawyers, just a man in a pressed shirt and tired eyes carrying a worn leather briefcase and the weight of too many wrong decisions. Sheriff Monroe met him at the door. No handcuffs yet, just a silent exchange that said more than any badge could. George was sitting in the corner of the room waiting. He didn't stand, didn't speak, just looked at the man who had almost taken away the one thing he still lived for, and in that moment he expected rage to rise, something hot and righteous. But it didn't come. Instead, he just felt hollow. Because when Elliot sat down and opened that briefcase, what spilled out wasn't excuses, it was evidence. Financial records, handwritten notes, names of families he'd helped, and most surprising letters. Dozens of them. All from parents, grandparents. People he had quietly paid medical bills for, used embezzled grant funds to save. 17 children, Elliot said, voice even. That's how many got treatment because of what I did. Bone marrow transplants, rare therapies, travel expenses to hospitals their insurance wouldn't cover. Monroe flipped through the papers. You stole from protected conservation funds, from federal programs. You forged land transfer documents, I know, and you left a young woman to die. Elliot's voice cracked. I panicked. Jenna confronted me, told me she was going public, said the kids I helped would lose everything, insurance, audits, investigations, that the land would be reclaimed. I didn't think. I just needed time. I thought if she disappeared for a day or two, I could fix it, make it right. George spoke for the first time. You tied her up. You drugged her. Elliot looked down. I know. There's no excuse. Outside the sheriff's office, the town had already started whispering. Ozark Falls wasn't big, maybe 1,200 people if you counted everyone who lived out past the mill road. News moved faster than truth in places like this, and the debate had already begun. Some wanted justice. Others whispered about mercy. On the church bulletin board, someone had pinned a note. He saved my son when no one else would. On the diner window, someone else taped a newspaper clipping with a photo of Jenna at a conservation rally, handwritten words beneath, almost died for telling the truth. The lines were drawn not in anger, but in heartbreak, because everyone had a connection. One woman's granddaughter was alive because Elliot had quietly paid for her cancer trial. A retired teacher said he'd helped her neighbor save their home when insurance collapsed. But those same people had also seen what he did to Jenna. They saw the photos, her wrists, the bruises, the well, and no one knew what to do with that. Because this wasn't a clean villain. This was someone who had done the unthinkable, for reasons that didn't fit neatly in good or evil. It's easy to demand punishment when harm is simple, when the person causing it has no heart. But when harm wears the same face as kindness, when it saves some while nearly destroying others, the questions get harder. George understood that tension better than most. He saw it in the church meeting that Sunday, when half the room prayed for justice and the other half prayed for healing. He heard it at the feed store, where old men in denim jackets debated whether a good deed done wrong still counted for something. One man said, "You don't punish someone for saving kids." Another replied, "You don't not punish someone for leaving a girl to drown." George didn't speak during those conversations, but he listened, and quietly he began asking himself what Martha would have said. She would have been furious, no doubt. The thought of Jenna in that well would have shattered her. But Martha was also the kind of woman who left casseroles for people she barely knew, who forgave too easily, who once raised money for a family whose son had stolen their garden tools. George remembered what she used to say when people made mistakes big enough to echo, "You can't unhurt someone, but you can choose what happens next." That line sat with him for days, until he found himself outside the community center where a town meeting was being held to discuss Elliot's charges. The room was packed. Jenna sat in the front row, Cedar's rescue story now the subject of statewide interest. Scout lay at her feet. George sat beside her. Elliot had waived his right to a lawyer for the hearing. He stood at the front, eyes sunken, voice clear. "I'll plead guilty. No deal. I'll serve whatever time the court decides. But I ask one thing, not for me, but for the families I helped. Don't claw the money back. Let them keep their homes. Let the children stay in treatment." He held up a letter. "This one's from a mother in Missouri. Her daughter had spinal muscular atrophy. The only treatment cost more than her house. She writes, 'You didn't just save my child. You gave us time to be a family.'" The room stayed silent. Jenna stood. "I believe in accountability," she said, voice steady. "I also believe in grace. What Mr. Harris did nearly killed me, but it also saved lives. And if we tear everything down, we punish the wrong people. The children, the parents, the ones with no part in his decisions." She looked around. "We need to do better than punishment. We need restoration." There it was. The lesson. Justice doesn't always mean pain. Sometimes it means rebuilding, not excusing, Not forgetting, but choosing the hard, slow work of making things right so that harm doesn't multiply, so that grief doesn't turn into vengeance, so that the community doesn't become the next victim. That night the vote was split down the middle, but it didn't matter, because Jenna had already made her choice. She and George met with the district attorney the next morning to propose something new, a restorative justice agreement. Elliot would serve time. He would also help establish a legal trust, the Cedar Project, named not for himself but for the Bobcat whose cry had kept Jenna alive. The fund would assist rural families facing medical debt, offer pro bono financial advice, and support wildlife rescue initiatives. And Elliot would help run it. From inside, not as a redemption arc, not to clear his name, but because, in Jenna's words, "You broke something, now help build something better." George watched it unfold from a distance. He still had questions, still had anger, but he also had something else. A sense that maybe, just maybe, the rope hadn't only pulled Jenna out of that well. Maybe it pulled the town out of a deeper one. Because that's what mercy does. It draws a line between justice and cruelty, and asks us which kind of world we want to live in. A full month passed before the envelope arrived. No postmark. No return address, just Jenna's name on the front in precise uppercase letters, and a small sticker of a pine tree in the corner, the kind a child might use to seal a note. It showed up in her foundation's mailbox, tucked between grant forms and vet invoices for rescued wild cat babies. Inside a single folded page, no greeting, no signature. Look again. The reason Amy died isn't what you think. Start with the billing records. That was all it said. Jenna stared at it for a long time. She had stopped expecting surprises. After Elliot's confession, after the community's painful debates, she thought they knew the whole story. He had stolen from government programs and non-profits, misled donors, and used the money to help sick children. He had panicked when she discovered the truth. She almost died. Then he turned himself in. But this note whispered a question that no one had thought to ask. What if the story was still incomplete? She spent the next 3 days combing through every document Elliot had submitted, focusing on one name, Amy Harris, Elliot's daughter. 12 years old when she died. Acute lymphoblastic leukemia. Denied coverage for an experimental therapy. That denial was the breaking point, the moment Elliot crossed from grief into action. He'd told Jenna, and later the sheriff, that the rejection shattered him. But as she pulled Amy's file from the scanned archive, something strange caught her eye. A date, stamped in the margin of an approval letter 2 days before Amy's death. Jenna blinked, checked it again. It wasn't a denial. It was a full authorization. The treatment had been approved, just not communicated. Buried in the hospital's system, labeled incorrectly, and it hadn't just been lost. It had been held. The internal email thread revealed more. A billing manager had deliberately delayed the notification. There were notes about shifting patients into the hospital's in-house protocol instead, which offered higher reimbursement rates. A line in one of the emails stopped her cold. "We can secure a stronger Q1 if we keep high-cost treatments internal." Amy had died because of a spreadsheet decision. Not because insurance said no, not because the treatment failed, because someone somewhere wanted the numbers to look better. Jenna sat alone in the foundation office, the lights dimmed. Scout curled under her desk, Cedar asleep on a nearby rug. Outside, the wind pushed leaves across the front step. She felt sick. And more than that, she felt angry. Not the kind of hot, sharp anger that leads to yelling, but the deep, hollow kind that breaks something inside you. Because if Elliot had known the truth, if he'd known his daughter could have lived, would he still have done all those things? Would he still have stolen, lied, nearly killed to keep his secrets buried? She didn't have an answer, but she knew who might. 2 days later, with a printed copy of the documents in hand, Jenna visited the jail. Elliot sat across from her behind glass, dressed in state-issued gray. His hands looked older, his posture more fragile. But when he saw her, he nodded respectfully. Not with expectation, just recognition. She slid the folder under the barrier. "You need to read this," she said. He opened it, read in silence, line by line. She watched the moment the realization hit. His hand trembled. His mouth opened slightly. He pressed his fingers to his lips like he was trying to stop something from coming out. Then he closed the folder. "I didn't know," he whispered. "My God, I didn't know." Jenna believed him, not because she trusted him, but because she recognized the expression. It was the face of a man discovering that everything he'd built from his pain was rooted in a lie, a preventable death, a system that failed not with a loud crash, but with quiet paperwork and unchecked greed. They sat in silence for a while. Finally, he asked, "Who did this billing supervisor?" she said. "She's still at the hospital. Got promoted, but I've already filed with the state board." Elliot shook his head slowly. "Amy could have lived." Jenna didn't respond. There was nothing to say, but she saw something shift in his eyes, not just grief, but clarity. A kind of grief that no longer asked for excuses, that didn't seek redemption, just acknowledgement. And that's when she knew something else. That the real cost of injustice isn't just what's taken, it's what's never given a chance to exist. Like Amy's future. And the better choices Elliot might have made if he'd known. It brought back a lesson she'd learned early in wildlife rescue trauma. Doesn't always look like violence. Sometimes it's just a missing step in the process. A form not filed, a cry not heard, a predator disguised as procedure. Back at the foundation, she met with George and the board. They agreed on one thing: the truth needed to come out. Not to clear Elliot's name, but to protect others from falling into the same well of grief and misdirection. The hospital would be investigated. A full audit, a formal complaint, and Jenna would testify not just as the near victim of attempted murder, but as a whistleblower fighting for systemic change. They began compiling a report, Amy's file. Emails, patterns of delayed authorizations, cases of cost-saving strategies resulting in denied treatments. One of the letters stood out. A mother from 2 towns over had lost her son to a similar delay. She wrote, "I used to think we lost him because we didn't pray hard enough. Now I wonder if we lost him because someone wanted a better fiscal quarter." Jenna included it in the final brief. Because that was the real root of it all. Not one man, not one rope, but a system that prioritized profit over people and created consequences too far-reaching to trace. George watched all this unfold with quiet pride. He never said much about the documents, but he started spending more time at the foundation building benches for the garden, helping Scout with his therapy dog visits. Sometimes he'd pause in the hallway, where Amy's photo now hung placed beside a plaque with her name. "Let the forgotten be remembered." That was the inscription, and maybe that was the lesson. Sometimes healing begins not by erasing the past, but by telling it truthfully, even when it hurts, even when it complicates things, especially when it does. Because beneath every story we think we understand, there's always a deeper one waiting, hidden under layers of assumption, silence, and good intentions gone wrong. Like a well in the woods, dark, quiet, but not empty. It was spring again in Elkhorn Ridge. You could hear it in the rustle of wind over soft grass, in the chirp of robins starting to return, and in the hesitant laughter of children rediscovering the park trails. But for Jenna, the season began not with a date, but with a sound, cedars purring under the willow tree in the memorial garden. That was how she knew they were healing. Not healed, not whole, just healing, and that was enough. The garden stood where the old well had once threatened to erase everything. The rope that saved her life was now part of the installation, weatherproofed, stretched between 2 wooden posts like a quiet monument. Nearby, a plaque bore a few simple words: "What was once darkness now grows light." Children didn't ask what it meant. They just ran past it on their way to plant butterfly milkweed and scatter seeds for the bee beds. But the adults, they lingered. George came every Sunday. He brought fresh compost, measured soil pH, and kept a close eye on the benches he'd crafted himself. He didn't talk much about Elliot anymore. though his name came up sometimes, like the time a local family donated $10,000 to the Martha Foundation and added because our child wouldn't be alive without his mistake. That was the kind of paradox Elkhorn Ridge was learning to live with. That people can be broken and still leave behind something beautiful. Scout, now fully certified as a therapy dog, spent most days wandering the nursing home and pediatric units. But on weekends he returned to the garden. Children instinctively found him drawn to his quiet stillness, the way he'd press against them without expectation. Cedar, meanwhile, had adjusted to her new reality. She still climbed trees and hissed at the lawnmower, but she no longer ran from people. She had chosen in some way to belong. Jenna watched them both from her office window, sometimes working late into the evening fundraising for another child's treatment. Every dollar mattered. Every form she filed was a small rebellion against the system that had let Amy Harris slip through its cracks. She often thought of that girl, of what might have been, but not with bitterness anymore. Just clarity. One Saturday, an older woman showed up unannounced. She stood by the rope monument, her hands shaking slightly. When Jenna approached, the woman turned eyes wet but determined. "My son was in the same program as Amy," she said. "I never knew what happened to her. I only knew she was suddenly gone." Jenna didn't respond right away. She just listened. The woman continued. "I blamed myself for a long time. Thought maybe I hadn't prayed hard enough. Maybe we weren't strong enough. But now..." She gestured toward the garden. "Now I see you turned that pain into something living." It was a strange moment, soft and heavy. "I'm just trying to make sure no other family stands where you did," Jenna said. "That's how we repay the dead," the woman whispered. "By saving the living." That day she donated her son's old wheelchair to the clinic. Said it was time someone else had the chance to move forward. Sometimes healing doesn't come from medicine. Sometimes it grows in soil. The garden taught them that. Each child who visited was encouraged to plant something. A basil sprig, a tomato seedling, a lavender start. No one judged the messiness of it. Some plants thrived, others didn't. That wasn't the point. The act of planting was itself an act of hope. Because to garden is to believe in tomorrow. And that belief was radical in a town that had once nearly buried its brightest. Jenna included these stories in every board meeting. Not just the data recovery rates, fundraising milestones, new policy wins, but the quiet triumphs, a father who no longer flinched when his daughter coughed. A nurse who volunteered after losing her sister. A boy who planted 3 sunflowers and whispered 1 for each round of chemo. There was light now woven into every corner of the work they did. And yet, not everything was resolved. Elliot died in prison before his final appeal could be heard. The official report listed heart failure. The unofficial truth was simpler. Some burdens outlast the body. But before he passed, he wrote one last letter. It wasn't long. "Tell her I'm proud of what she built. And I'm sorry she ever had to." They didn't make it public. Some stories are meant to stay between the broken and those who choose to forgive them. The town, for its part, had begun to shift. After Patricia Morse's conviction and the audit of Riverbend Medical, new oversight protocols were passed statewide. The Elkhorn Health Initiative, co-written by Jenna and a young state senator, required hospitals to disclose all treatment approvals within 24 hours. One small change, but potentially life-saving. That's the thing about systems, they're not inherently cruel, but left unchecked, they prioritize efficiency over empathy. What Jenna George and the Foundation fought for wasn't perfection, it was humanity. It wasn't about fixing everything, just about not ignoring it anymore. One afternoon, a girl no older than 6 wandered into the garden alone. Jenna saw her from the porch and followed quietly. The girl crouched beside the plaque, running her fingers across the engraved letters. "You know what I think," she said, not turning around. "What?" Jenna asked. "I think the rope's magic." Jenna smiled softly. "Why's that?" "Because it pulls people out of dark places, even if they're not in a well." That evening, Jenna wrote the line down and taped it to her office wall. "The rope is magic." And maybe it was. Not because of what it was made of, but because of what it represented. Every person in that community had touched it in some way. Some had held it literally. Others had been held by it through care, compassion, and truth. George once said that healing isn't a straight path. It loops and dips and sometimes leads back to the very well you thought you escaped. But if you're lucky, someone's always holding the other end of the rope. Maybe a friend, maybe a stranger, maybe even a bobcat who cried at the edge until help arrived. Now the final rope worn, patched strong, hung in the garden's open pergola. Children sat under it to read. Couples married beneath it. Survivors came to sit in silence. And occasionally, someone would reach out to touch it, just to remind themselves we're never beyond saving. So, here's the question for you. The one still listening, the one who made it this far. What is the rope in your life? What keeps you anchored when the world feels like a deep, dark well? Is it a person, a memory, a belief, a second chance? Whatever it is, hold it tight. And if you see someone else slipping, offer them a piece of yours. Because that's how we heal. Not alone, not all at once, but together, one rope, one garden, one life at a time. If this young bobcat meant something to you even quietly, thank you for feeling it with me. And thank you if you choose to give. If this story moved you, if it made you think of someone who pulled you through or someone you'd fight to save, please like and subscribe. There are more stories like this one, and more ropes we need to throw. Let's keep building the garden, together.